Send your scariest workplace stories to us at eriecast.com/submit and rate and review Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thanks.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Today we're taking a little trip across the country to various state parks, because each one has its legends, its stories, its terrors. And honestly, a hike through a state park beats the Java out of being cooped up at a coffee joint all day. Welcome back, my friends, and prepare yourself for a brand new set of work stories, all about disturbing confessions from state park employees. Just remember, don't be the last in line out there in those woods. Never go alone. And no matter what, do not answer the voices without bodies. These are Tales from the Break Room. It Wasn't a Bear. From Nolton. It was late October, a few years back, when I had the most terrifying experience of my life. I was working as a ranger at a remote state park in the mountains. I won't be specific for the sake of privacy. The park was officially closed for the season, but we kept a skeleton crew on to do maintenance, look after the equipment, and keep an eye out for trespassers, which the place got a lot of. I drew the short straw and was put on the night shift, alone at the main ranger station. Most nights were dead quiet, though, with only the sound of the wind in the pines and an occasional car passing on the highway a few miles away. To pass the time, I'd watch movies, read books, and whittle little wood carvings. Anything to stay awake and not let the eerie stillness get to me, as it often does. This one night around 2 a.m., I was in the back room making a cup of coffee when I heard a thud against the side of the building. Probably just a pine cone falling on the roof, I thought. Then I heard it again. A thud. And again, a louder thud. I froze. The thuds continued, moving along the wall. It sounded like heavy, deliberate footsteps. But that was impossible. I was the only one out here. The thuds reached the corner of the building, heading towards the front door. My heart pounded as I crept towards the front room. I peered out the window. The floodlight illuminated the gravel driveway and the edge of the forest. I didn't see anything, but the footsteps were getting closer, crunching on the gravel now. Something was out there, circling the building, doing something against the wall, now approaching the door. Whatever it was big. I backed away from the window, my hand shaking as I unclipped the holster of my sidearm. Then the footsteps stopped, right outside the door. Suddenly, wham! The door shuddered as something slammed into it, rattling the frame. I jumped back, drawing my gun and aiming it at the door with trembling hands. Another wham! The door buckled from another impact. The lock and deadbolt strained to hold. Then there was a crash. The door frame splintered as the door burst open. A dark shape loomed in the doorway. I screamed and fired. When the hulking figure only staggered but kept coming forwards, I turned to run. Behind me, a deep and raspy breathing came. I sprinted to the back room and slammed the door shut. Fumbling with my keys, I managed to lock it. I grabbed the desk and shoved it against the door as a barricade. Then bam, that thing rammed against the door. The desk shuddered, but held. I could hear it walking around outside, its heavy breathing snuffling around the door. I backed into the corner and sank down, gun trained on the door. My radio crackled alive, startling me. "Dave, come in, over." It was Mike, my supervisor, doing the regular check-in from the ranger station on the other side of the park. Mike, I need help. There's something trying to get in here. It broke down the front door. I'm trapped in the back room." Get help! Hurry! I hissed into the radio. Whoa, slow down. What's going on? What do you mean something's trying to get in? I don't know. A bear, maybe? I don't really know what it is. Just get help. All right, sit tight. I'm calling for backup. Just stay calm and don't do anything stupid. The radio went silent. The thing outside the door had gone quiet too. Was it listening to us? For a moment, all I could hear was the blood pounding in my ears. Then there was a clatter from the front room that made me flinch. It sounded like furniture being knocked over. There was a pause, then more clattering, moving further away. After a few moments, I couldn't hear anything, but my heart was still racing. I crept to the door and put my ear against it. Silence. Even so, I didn't dare open it. Hours passed as I crouched behind that desk, gun ready in my trembling hands. Finally, I began to hear vehicles pulling up outside. Shouts, radio squawking, beams of flashlights sweeping through the windows. Dave? Dave, you in there? Mike's muffled voice called from the other side of the door. I wanted to cry in relief. I pushed aside the desk and opened it up. The front room was trashed. Chairs overturned, maps and papers scattered everywhere. The front door hanging off its hinges. But no sign of my intruder. What the heck happened here? Mike asked, surveying the damage. Something tried to break in. It got in the front room, obviously, but it didn't get to the back. I shot at it too. The thing just kept coming. It cornered me back there, thought it was going to get through the door. What was it? Did you get a good look? He picked up a shell casing and frowned. Looks like you aren't lying. Mike, I don't know what it was. It was dark. I couldn't really see. It was big, though. Not like any bear I've seen. I could barely get those words out. My throat was tight with fear. Well, it's gone now. Took off into the woods, looks like. He nodded at the muddy tracks leading away from the porch. Let's get this cleaned up. You can write up a report in the morning. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dark shape filling the doorway. I turned in my report, but I couldn't give a clear description of what it was. Obviously, the department seemed skeptical of my story, but they couldn't deny the damage to the ranger station. They brought in a wildlife expert to examine the tracks, but even he couldn't definitively say what had made them. Could be a bear, he said, scratching his head. But I've never seen bear tracks quite like this. In the following weeks, I tried to put the incident out of my mind, focusing on my work. Every night shift filled me with dread, though. I jumped at every noise, every shadow. I started to carry a higher caliber weapon, and I was very particular about keeping the doors and windows shut and locked. My colleagues noticed the change in me. They'd give me concerned looks when they thought I wasn't watching, whispering behind my back. I knew they thought I was probably losing it. Maybe I was. About a month after the attack, I was out on a routine patrol of the hiking trails. It was a crisp, clear day, and the forest was peaceful. I almost felt at ease. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I spotted something on the ground ahead. I approached cautiously. It was a deer, or what was left of one. The carcass had been brutally mauled, flesh torn, bones crushed. The surrounding foliage had been trampled and splattered with blood. Quite clearly the work of a predator, but far more vicious than your average mountain lion or coyote. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered that thing that had come after me that night. Could it have done this? I looked around warily, suddenly feeling very exposed out there in the woods. I radioed it in, and soon the site was crawling with rangers and wildlife officers. They took samples, snapped photos, looked for tracks. But just like at the ranger station, they could not find any definitive evidence of what had killed the deer. Over the next few months, more animal mutilations turned up in the park. Deer, elk, one of them was even a black bear. Each one was more gruesome than the last, and always no clear tracks, no viable evidence of the killer. Rumors began to spread among the park staff. Some thought it was a rogue cougar or a wolf pack. Others whispered about something unnatural, a creature that defied explanation. I knew they were all dancing around what I'd seen that night, but no one wanted to say it outright. As the attacks continued and grew closer to the hiking trails and campgrounds, the park superintendent grew increasingly concerned. He brought in a team of experienced hunters to try to track and kill the creature, whatever it was. I was assigned to guide the hunters through the back country. As much as the thought of confronting the thing terrified me, I also desperately wanted answers and a resolution. For days we trekked through the rugged terrain, following faint trails and signs of the supposed creature's passing. We did find more grisly kills, but the beast itself remained elusive. It seemed to be toying with us, always one step ahead, wanting us to find those brutal remains. One evening, as we were setting up camp in a dense patch of forest, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. It sounded almost human, but distorted, feral. The hunters grabbed their weapons, and we ran towards the sound. One of the hunters ahead of us crouched down at a small clearing, laying his rifle on the ground beside him. He was staring into the trees, his face white with shock. "I saw it," he whispered as we approached. It looked right at me." "What was it? What did you see?" I asked, my heart pounding. He shook his head, unable to find the words. Not natural. Those eyes." He trailed off, shuddering. A twig snapped in the forest behind us. We spun around, rifles raised. Something large was moving around through the underbrush, circling us. We could hear its heavy breathing, the crunching of its footsteps. Then it emerged from the trees, and I felt my blood turn to ice. It was just as I remembered. That hulking, shadowy figure, vaguely humanoid, but far too large. Its eyes glinted in the fading light, filled with a feral, predatory intelligence. The hunters, now sure it was not a person, aimed and fired together. Whatever it was, roared a grumbling roar, a sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath us. Then it did something we didn't expect a creature, who had just taken a full barrage of bullets, to do. It charged at us. The entire group scattered. I heard screaming behind me, but I ignored it, just running, blindly crashing through the forest. My only thought was to get away, to stay alive. I don't know how long or far I ran. Eventually, I stumbled into a small stream and fell to my knees, gasping for breath. The forest had gone quiet again. No sign of the hunters, and thankfully no sign of the creature. It was deep into the night by the time I found my way back to the main park roads. I staggered into the ranger station, covered in scratches and bruises, my clothes torn. The superintendent was there, along with a group of grim-faced park police and the hunters who had been attacked. Well, except for one. All but one of the hunters had made it back. The official story was it had been a bear attack. The park was closed for some time, and a massive search began for the missing man. But I knew how it would end. Maybe I was scared and paranoid and pessimistic, but I knew what the results would be. Because whatever it was out there, It was beyond our understanding, and I don't think it liked to leave things alive. In the months that followed, I retreated into myself. I couldn't shake the memory of that night in the forest, the sheer terror of coming face to face with it not once, but twice. I would never feel safe in the woods again. But more than that, I was haunted by the idea it was still out there. So, obviously, I don't work at the park anymore. And now every interest and passion I had in the outdoors is dead. Because every time I'm out in the trees, I can't stop thinking what I might see around the bend, or what might see me. God help anyone who stands in that thing's way when they sadly encounter it out in the forest. Help Me, from Laury Story. For a few years, I worked at Adirondack Park as a park ranger. It's a huge park, covering over 6 million acres in upstate New York. It's got everything: mountains, forests, lakes, rivers. It's beautiful. But it can also be pretty wild and remote in places. I was stationed at one of the more isolated ranger outposts, near the western edge of the park. It's a small cabin, really only used by rangers and the occasional backpacker or hunter who ventures out this far. It's a quiet posting, which suits me just fine. I like the solitude, being out in nature. But it can be a little spooky at times, especially at night. There's a lot of history in these woods. The Adirondacks were home to Native American tribes for centuries before European settlers arrived. There were a lot of conflicts, a lot of bloodshed as the land changed hands. Then there were the logging and mining operations in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The park is dotted with the remains of old logging camps and mining towns, just crumbling foundations and rusting equipment left behind when the industries died out. Some of the other rangers, the ones who have been here longer, they talk about strange things they've seen or heard out in the woods. Lights in the night sky, sounds that just don't belong, those sort of things. I always took it with a grain of salt. You spend enough time out in the wilderness, your mind can start to play tricks on you. But then, a couple of months ago, I started to experience some weird things myself. It started with small stuff. I'd be out on a trail and get this feeling like I was being watched. I would turn around, expecting to see another hiker, maybe a deer, but there would be nothing there. Then I began to hear noises at night when I was alone in my cabin. Footsteps on the porch, the creak of the old rocking chair outside. Whenever I'd get up to check, there was never anyone there. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. But it kept happening, and it started to feel more and more sinister. One night I woke up to the sound of whispering. It sounded like it was coming from right outside my window. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent a chill down my spine. It sounded angry, almost threatening. I lay there in my bunk, my heart pounding, trying to convince myself I was just dreaming. But then I heard the doorknob rattle, like someone wanted to get inside. I jumped up, grabbed my flashlight and my gun. But when I got to the door, there was no one there. The night was quiet, still. After that, things began to escalate. I would find strange symbols carved into trees, arranged rocks and sticks in patterns that did not look natural. Once, on a remote trail, I found the remains of what looked like some kind of ritual site. A circle of stones, charred animal bones in the center. I reported this, of course, but there wasn't much the park authorities could really do. There was no evidence of who had done it, or why. I started to do some research into the history of the area, trying to find some explanation for what was happening. That's when I came across the stories about an asylum. Now, bear in mind, I don't know how true this is, but according to the article I read back then, back in the 1920s, there was a small mental hospital built on what is now park land. It was meant to be a place of healing, using the fresh mountain air and natural surroundings to help treat patients. But the stories about the place were quite dark. Rumors of patient mistreatment, of experimental treatments that crossed ethical lines. There were even tales of patients who went missing, never to be seen again. The supposed asylum closed down in the 1950s, and the building was demolished not long after. But some of the rangers say the site is still haunted by the spirits of the patients who suffered there. If another ranger or two confirmed this story, maybe it was true. But I personally couldn't find much more info about the asylum that was supposed to be there. Now, I didn't put much stock into ghost stories, but I couldn't deny that something strange was going on. These incidents kept happening, getting more and more disturbing. It all came to a head one night. I was alone in the cabin as usual. It was a dark and moonless night, the kind where the forest seems to press in around you. I was just getting ready for bed when I heard it, a scream, coming from somewhere out in the woods. It made my blood run cold. It sounded like a woman, and she was terrified. I grabbed my gear and ran out into the night, my flashlight bouncing off the trees. The scream came again, fainter this time, like it was moving away. I followed the sound deeper into the forest, my heart pounding in my ears. I knew I was breaking protocol, that I should radio for backup. But there was no time for that. Someone might be in trouble, I thought. The trail led me to a small clearing. That's when I saw it. There was something in the center of that clearing, something dark and unnatural. As I drew closer, I could make out more details, and what I saw made my stomach turn. It was, well, I'm still not sure exactly what it was, but it was terrifying. Give me a moment, I'll get there. That's when things took a turn for the worse. As I stepped into the clearing, the beam of my flashlight fell upon the sight that had made my blood run cold. In the center of the open space was this figure, hunched, unmoving. At first, I thought it might be the woman I'd heard scream, but as I drew closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It was humanoid in shape, but there was something wrong about its proportions. Its limbs were too long, body too thin, and the way it was crouched, with its head bent at an unnatural angle. It just didn't look human. Even so, I called out, my voice shaky. "Hello? Are you all right?" The figure did not respond. It didn't even move. I took another step closer, my hand tightening on my flashlight. And then, suddenly, its head snapped up. I stumbled back, a scream lodged in my throat. Where there should have been a face, I saw nothing, just a smooth, featureless expanse of pale skin. The thing rose to its feet, unfolding itself like a marionette pulled by invisible strings, and it towered over me, well over 7 feet tall. I turned to run, but my feet would not move. It was like I was frozen there, my muscles locked into place with terror. The creature took a step closer, then another. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like it wasn't quite used to its own body. I finally managed to break out of my paralysis. I ran then, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my face and arms. But I could hear it behind me, moving through the forest with a terrifying speed. It didn't seem at all hindered by the dense growth at all. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they were going to give out. And then I burst from the trees and found myself at what appeared to be an old asylum site. I never even realized where I was going. But there I was, standing in front of a crumbling foundation, the rusted remains of old metal beds and medical equipment scattered about. So it was real. I spun around, expecting to see the creature burst from the trees behind me, but there was nothing. The forest was silent. I stood there for a long moment, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. That's when I heard it. A whisper coming from the ruins of the old hospital. "Help me, help me." It was a woman's voice. I think it was the same one I'd heard screaming from the woods. But there was something else in the voice now, something that made my skin crawl. It sounded not quite human. Against my better judgment, I moved towards the ruins. I picked my way through debris, shining my light into the shadows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding so small in the darkness. "Is someone here?" I heard a sound off to my right, a shuffling noise. I turned, and my light fell upon a figure huddled in the corner of the ruins. If I had to guess, that may have been a patient's room at one point. There was a woman, dressed in a tattered hospital gown. Her hair was long and matted, her skin pale and waxy. She looked up at me, and I saw her eyes that were nothing but dark, empty sockets. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice dry and rasping. Please. I took a step back. This couldn't be real. I was having some kind of hallucination, a trick of my exhausted and scared mind out here in the dark. But then, the woman began to change. Her body shifted, twisted, her limbs growing longer, her face melting away into that same blank, featureless mask that I'd seen in the woods. I ran, stumbling back out into the night. I could hear that thing behind me, could hear its footsteps crunching on the dead leaves and twigs. I don't know how I made it back to the cabin. I must have run for miles, fueled by pure adrenaline. I burst through the door, slammed it shut behind me, and collapsed on the floor. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner, my gun in my hands, jumping at every single noise. I kept expecting to hear that whispering voice again, or to see that pale, featureless face in the window. But nothing happened. The night passed, and the sun rose, and I was still alive. I radioed for help as soon as I could, but I told them something. Not the full story, not all the details. I knew how it would sound. I just said that someone was in those woods, and I'd heard them screaming. The rest I simply couldn't explain. A couple of rangers were sent to investigate, but nothing was found. There was no trace of the creature, and in fact, they found no evidence of an old asylum site. It was like it all never happened. But I know what I saw. I know it was real, and I know it's out there somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Adirondacks. After that event, I requested a transfer to a different posting, somewhere far away from there, and a few months after the transfer, I found a different career entirely. A part of me still wonders, was it just a coincidence that it appeared to me? Or was I chosen, singled out for some reason I'll never know? What I do know, though, is I'll never see the woods the same way again. There are things out there, I know that now, things we can't explain. And sometimes when the night is dark and the forest is silent, you might just hear a whisper, a pleading voice echoing in your mind, saying, "Help me, help me." Interloper. From 883 Grix. I've been working as a park ranger at a state park in the Midwest for about 3 years now. It's a great job, funnest and most fulfilling one I've had, I mean, who doesn't like spending their days in nature? Really, all I do is make sure the park is safe and well maintained for visitors. Keep track of wildlife here and there, too. Sometimes, though, when I'm on the night shift, things get a little eerie. Might just be human nature, but when the woods get dark, you start to feel a little creeped out sometimes. This happened on a typical evening in early September. The summer crowds had thinned out by then, but we still had a decent number of campers scattered throughout the park. I was doing my usual rounds, checking the trails and campsites, making sure everything was in order. I had just finished inspecting the campground at a place we called the Meadows, and I was heading down a mountainous trail when I noticed a light flickering through the trees. It was coming from one of the backcountry campsites, a small clearing about a quarter mile off the main trail. That struck me as odd. These sites are primitive. No electricity, no running water. Campers out there usually rely on lanterns or campfires for light. But this light was different. There was an artificial quality to it, maybe a flashlight or a headlamp. As I got closer, I could make out a tent set up in the clearing. The light was coming from inside. I approached cautiously, not wanting to startle whoever was in there. I was about 20 yards away when I saw movement going towards the tent. A man, who didn't see me yet, looked around, then crawled oddly quietly inside. Once inside, he let out this weird, stifled moan. It was almost pained. Then I watched the tent flap begin to shuffle about as the man crawled back out. He moved so oddly, almost slithering on his belly before rising to his feet. He straightened up, then looked right at me. That's when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't quite right here, and I wasn't sure what it was. Having been caught, I stepped out of the shadows, shining my flashlight towards the man. Evening, I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. Everything all right over here? The man's eyes grew wide, as if somehow he'd been startled despite having seen me already. He looked to be in his late 30s. He had a thin, wiry build and unkempt hair. He wore a dark hoodie and jeans. "Oh, hi, Ranger," he said, his voice a bit shaky. "Yeah, everything's fine. I haven't been feeling well, that's all." He gestured vaguely towards the tent, trying to explain the moan I'd heard, I guess. I kept my light trained on him, studying his face. He was sweating, but the night was cool, and there was something about his expression, a tightness around his eyes, even a twitchiness in his movements. "You sure you're all right?" I asked, taking a step closer. That didn't sound good coming from your tent. No, it's fine," he insisted, backing away from me. Just a stomach ache. I think I ate something bad. I'll be all right." He was rambling, his words tumbling out in a nervous rush. His eyes kept darting from me to the tent and back again. I didn't believe him for a second. I wasn't sure what was going on. I think I thought maybe drugs at the moment. But I didn't have any concrete reason to press the issue, really. No evidence. And campers do get sick all the time. As long as they're not disturbing anyone else or posing a danger to themselves, it's not really my business. "Well, all right," I said slowly. "If you need anything, you know where to find me. I'll be at the ranger station up the trail." I nodded in that direction. "Yeah, sure, thanks," he mumbled. He was already edging away from me, moving towards the trail that led back to the main campground. I'm gonna head to the restroom. I'll be fine." Makes sense, I thought. And with that, he hurried off into the darkness, leaving me standing there with a growing sense of unease. I looked back at his tent, silent and still in the moonlight. I considered going over to check inside just to be sure, but something held me back. Call it instinct, maybe just a healthy respect for people's privacy. I finished my patrol, then returned to the station. But I could not shake that feeling that something was off about that encounter. I kept replaying it in my head. The strange moan, the man's nervous behavior, the way he had crawled into and out of that tent. I was still thinking about it the next morning when I got a call from the park superintendent. There had been an incident at one of the backcountry campsites. A murder. My stomach dropped as I listened to the details. A young woman had been stabbed multiple times in her sleeping bag, no sign of a struggle, no defensive wounds. She probably never even got a chance to wake up. And the suspect, I recognized him right away. The man I'd seen crawling out of that tent. The one who had been acting so strangely. Turns out he had been dating the victim. They'd come out to the park together for a camping trip. The other rangers found him at the edge of the park, trying to hike out to the nearest road. The guy had a wild, desperate look in his eyes, and when they confronted him, he broke down, sobbing and rambling about voices in his head about how he never meant to do it. That shook me to my core. To think that I'd been that close to a killer, that I had basically seen him do it. That agonized moan I'd heard was not his. It was almost all too much to process. Turns out the man had a history of mental illness and erratic behavior. There had been warning signs, incidents in the past that went unaddressed. I kept thinking back to that moment on the trail, wondering if I could have done something differently. Maybe I should have pressed harder. Maybe I should have insisted on checking the tent. Subconsciously, I tell myself I could have saved her life. But then I remind myself she was already dead then. That last moan she gave, the life leaving her body. Makes me feel sick thinking about it. Rationally, I know it's not my fault. I did my job. I followed protocol. There was no way I could have known what he had done. But it still gnaws at me, wouldn't it you? This event changed the way I approach my work. I'm much more cautious now, more attuned to the subtle signs that something might be amiss. I do my best to trust my instincts more, and I'm not afraid to ask tougher questions when something's feeling odd. Because if there's one thing I've learned from this, it's that the wilderness isn't the only thing that can be dangerous out there. Sometimes the real threats are the ones that look just like us. The ones that can crawl out of a tent with a smile and lie. Bird watching. From Wine Mom 1980. I work as a ranger at Big Basin Redwood State Park. It's a job that comes with its fair share of unusual experiences. You're out in nature, dealing with all sorts of people and situations. There is an incident from a few years back that still leaves me scratching my head and a little creeped out. It was the summer of 2018. I was partnered up with another ranger, I'll call him Jacob, for the season. Our main task that season was to conduct a study on the park's bird populations, counting them, tracking their movements, those sorts of things. It's a big park, so it kept us pretty busy. About a week into the assignment, we started to get some strange reports over the radio. Apparently, there had been sightings of some suspicious individuals in the more remote areas of the park. These reports were vague, but the gist was that these people were up to some kind of mischief. Possibly pranks or vandalism. We were told to keep an eye out and to report any unusual activity. Jacob and I didn't think too much of this at first. We already had our hands full with the bird study, and dealing with the occasional troublemaker was just part of the job. But looking back, I wish we had paid more attention. It happened one evening, just as we were wrapping up our observations for the day. We were in a very isolated spot, a couple miles off the main trail. It was that golden hour just before sunset when the light filters through the redwoods in this really beautiful way. We were packing up our gear when Jacob suddenly grabbed me by the arm. "Look," he whispered, pointing to a nearby clearing. At first, I was not sure what he was seeing, but then I saw the movement. There was a group of people, maybe a dozen or so, walking in a single file line through the woods. They were all dressed in black from head to toe, like they were in some kind of uniform. It was eerie, the way they moved in perfect unison, their faces obscured by hoods. As they entered the clearing, they formed a circle, and then the chanting began. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Guttural, primal, almost inhuman. It sounded like throat singing, but with a dark and menacing edge. Jacob and I stood there, dumbfounded and frozen, unsure what to do. We were outnumbered, and something about the situation felt deeply weird. But we also knew we couldn't just ignore this. The chanting grew louder, more frenzied. And then, as if on some unseen signal, each person reached into their pocket and pulled out what looked like a small pouch. It was similar to a Capri Sun pouch. They raised these pouches to their lips and drank deeply. What happened next will continue to haunt me. One by one, they all fell to the ground, their bodies beginning to convulse violently. They looked to all be having seizures, all at once. The clearing was filled with the sounds of thrashing limbs and horrific, garbled noises that I can only assume were choked screams. Jacob and I looked at each other in horror. This was way beyond anything we were trained to deal with. We had basic first aid training, really, but this was something else entirely. With shaky hands, I grabbed my radio and called it in. I tried to keep my voice steady as I described what was happening, but I'm sure that dispatch could hear the panic in my words. They told us to sit tight. Backup and medical were on the way. We waited there at the edge of the clearing, watching helplessly as the figures continued to seize and convulse. It seemed to go on forever, though in reality it was probably only a few minutes. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Those people, cloaked in the shadows, lay still on the ground, unmoving. The silence that followed was almost worse than the chaos that had preceded it. Jacob wanted to go check on them, but I held him back. Something in my gut told me it wasn't safe, that we needed to wait for help. It felt like forever before they arrived. When they showed up, we met with them and led them back to the clearing nearby, bracing ourselves for the worst. But you're not going to believe what we found. Every single one of them, who had just been convulsing before, was now gone. The clearing was empty. All that remained were a few of the strange pouches, which had been left behind in the grass. The medics were baffled, the other rangers even more so. A thorough search of the area turned up nothing. It was like those people had never been there at all. I gave my statement, tried to describe what we'd seen in as much detail as I could. But even as I was saying the words, I could hear how crazy it sounded. A secret cult in the woods, a mass-induced seizure, followed by a mysterious disappearance. It was like something out of a psychological horror film. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to find out more. I asked my higher-ups if the remaining liquids in those pouches had been tested yet, as I figured that might give us some clue as to what had happened, what those people were doing out there. But I didn't get a straight answer. My higher-ups were strangely tight-lipped about the whole thing. Eventually, it sort of just faded away. There were no more sightings, no more strange reports. Life in the park went back to normal, as if it had never happened. But I haven't forgotten. I can't forget the sound of that chanting, the sight of those bodies convulsing in the fading light. It's seared into my memory. I wonder, were they some kind of cult engaging in a bizarre ritual? What kind of drug was in those pouches? And why did they choose our park, that specific spot? If there's any other cults out there planning to do the same, please leave innocent eyes out of it. No one needs to see that. If you hear a strange voice in the woods, ignore it. From Daniel K.M. This happened at a certain state park in Arkansas that will remain nameless. I'd been working there for a few years, and I can tell you the place is beautiful. It's the kind of place that makes you feel small in the best possible way, like you're just a tiny part of something much bigger, something older than yourself. As a ranger, my job was to make sure the park was safe and accessible for visitors, protecting the natural environment too. There's a balance to it, not always an easy one. You get all kinds, the seasoned outdoorsmen who know the trails like the back of their hand, the families with young kids who are just there for a weekend campout, and those city slickers who think roughing it means a cabin without Wi-Fi. Most of the time it's pretty routine stuff, giving directions and enforcing park rules. Sometimes I help out with a twisted ankle or a lost hiker. But every once in a while, something happens that reminds you that the wilderness isn't always as friendly as it appears. It started with a few strange reports from hikers. They'd come into the ranger station looking confused and unsettled, telling stories of hearing voices out on the trails. Voices that sounded human, but not quite right. One woman, I recall, an experienced hiker in her 50s, swore she had heard a child crying just off the trail. "It sounded so real," she said. Her hands trembled as she clutched her hiking poles. "I thought maybe a little one had wandered away from her family. I called out, but no one answered. And then..." She paused, her eyes distant. "Then the crying turned into laughter. It wasn't happy either. It was cruel, almost mocking. I felt like something out there wanted to trick me." Another hiker, a young man who had been camping solo, reported hearing someone whispering his name near his tent in the middle of the night. "I thought maybe I was dreaming at first," he said. "But then I heard it again, louder. Sounded like it was coming from just outside. I grabbed my flashlight and looked out, but there was no one around." Reports like these were quite unsettling, but they weren't necessarily unheard of. The woods can play tricks on your mind, especially if you're not used to being in such a quiet, isolated place, alone. Sounds can carry strangely too, and an overactive imagination can easily turn a gust of wind or a rustling animal into something sinister. Still, something about these reports felt different. The consistency of the stories and the specific details sounded like these people had encountered something that was actively trying to mess with them. The other rangers and I started to compare notes, trying to see if there was a pattern to this. The reports seemed to be concentrated around a specific area of the park, a dense patch of old-growth forest that wasn't heavily trafficked by hikers. We decided to do some extra patrols in that area, just to be safe. But even in broad daylight, with the comfort of a partner by your side, there was something about those woods that felt off. The air seemed heavier there. The shadows seemed deeper. It was like the trees were watching you too, whispering secrets just beyond the range of our hearing. One evening, after a long day of patrols, a group of us rangers were sitting around the wood stove in one of the park cabins. This had become a bit of a tradition, a chance to unwind, swap stories, maybe play a few rounds of cards before heading home for the night. The conversation inevitably turned to the strange reports we'd been getting. We all had our theories, a prank by some local kids or some weird acoustic phenomena. One of the guys even said it was a rare type of bird that could mimic human sounds really well. One of the older rangers spoke up. He had a reputation of being a bit of a storyteller and superstitious, but there was no twinkle in his eye as he leaned forward, voice low and serious. "You ever hear of something called a Wendigo?" he asked. A few of us shook our heads. I felt a chill run down my spine. I'd heard of it before, in some half-remembered folklore. "Native American legend," Jake continued. "A creature that was once human but became something else. Something evil. They say it happens when a person resorts to cannibalism out of desperation or madness. Changes them. Twists them into a monster that's never satisfied, always hungry for human flesh." "Sure," one of the younger rangers said, looking skeptical. "A Wendigo. If that was even the case, what does that have to do with the voices?" "The Wendigo's a mimic," the older man said. "Legend has it can imitate human voices, lure people in, make them think they're hearing a friend or a loved one in distress. And then, when you're close enough..." He snapped his fingers, startling most of us. Silence fell over the room. I could hear the wind whistling through the trees outside, the crackle of the fire on the stove. "It's just a legend, just a fairy tale, guys. Nothing real about it," someone said. But the old man shrugged. "Most legends have some truth to them. And I'll tell you this. I've been working these woods for a long time, y'all know that. And I ain't ever heard nothing like these reports before. I think something's out there, and I think it ain't no bird." We exchanged uneasy glances. The idea of a mythical man-eating monster stalking the woods was absurd. Then again, so were the stories we'd been hearing from the hikers. We decided to keep a closer eye on things, maybe do some research into the history of the area. See if there had ever been any strange disappearances, any old stories that might shed some light on what was really going on. I volunteered to take the lead on the research. I've always been interested in local history and folklore. I figured it wouldn't hurt to know more about the place I worked at. But the horror would soon turn very real. And it all started with a routine solo patrol on a crisp autumn morning when the mist hung low over the trails. Because that was the day I heard the voice myself. The morning started like any other. I arrived at the ranger station just as the sun was starting to peek through the trees, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I checked in with dispatch, grabbed my gear, and set out on my assigned patrol route. I was headed towards the area where most of the strange reports had been coming from. That area that I mentioned before, the old growth forest. The place was very steep and rocky too. The trail there was narrow and winding, easy to lose if you weren't paying attention. But I worked here. I had hiked this route dozens of times before. But let me tell you, something felt different that morning. The air was unusually still, and the forest seemed quieter than normal. Even the birds were silent, as if they were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to the stories we'd been hearing and the late-night talk of wendigos around the wood stove. I'm a grown man, I reminded myself, and a ranger at that. I knew these woods. I knew there was nothing out here that I couldn't handle. About an hour into my hike, I stopped for a water break at a small clearing. It was a peaceful spot with a fallen log that made a perfect bench and a view of the valley below through a gap in the trees. As I took a swig from my canteen, I heard it. A voice coming from somewhere off the trail behind me. "Please help." I froze, the water still in my mouth. The voice sounded like a child, a little girl. It was faint but clear and filled with a desperate, pleading tone. I swallowed, put down the canteen, and called back. Hello? Someone out there? Silence. But then, again, a little louder. Please help me. I was already moving, plunging into the underbrush in the direction of the voice. My training kicked in. I knew I should radio for backup, but there wasn't time. If there was a child out there, lost or hurt, every second counted. I crashed through the bushes, thorns snagging at my uniform. That voice seemed to be moving, always just ahead of me somehow, leading me deeper into the trees. I'm coming, I shouted. Stay where you are. I'm coming to help. And then, abruptly, the voice changed. The pleading tone shifted, morphed into something else, something darker. Found you. It whispered, and I could swear I felt breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no one there. Just the trees, the underbrush, the dappled sunlight through the leaves. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, an auditory illusion brought on by stress and suggestion. But then I heard something else, a laugh just on the edge of my hearing. That sound made the hairs on my arms stand up, my skin crawl. Got you. It was the girl's voice again, but twisted now, warped into something unnatural. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Who are you? I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. What do you want? The laughter came again, louder than before. It seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, echoing off the trees. I took a step back, my hand going to the radio on my belt, but before I could grab it, the voice spoke again. No cheating. It hissed. Suddenly it was right behind me, so close I could feel the brush of air on my ear. I whirled, lashing out with my fist, but I hit nothing but air. The laughter was all around again, rising and falling in a sickening wave. What are you? I shouted. Even I could hear the desperation in my voice. What the heck are you? The laugh turned to the laughter of a child again, but there was nothing innocent about it. So I ran, blundered through the trees, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away from that voice, that awful twisted sound. To my horror, it followed me, darting from tree to tree, always just out of sight. One moment it was ahead of me, the next behind. A man, a woman, a child, a thing that was none of those, but all of those at once. Run. It chanted now. I stumbled then, falling to my knees in a tangle of roots and dead leaves. The voice laughed again, a sound like breaking glass. I squeezed my eyes shut, clasping my hands over my ears. This couldn't be happening. It couldn't be real. But I could still hear it, even through my hands. That horrible mocking laughter, and underneath it, a sound even worse. A new sound, wet and tearing, like flesh being pulled from the bone. I don't really know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear. Could have been minutes, could have been hours. I mean, at that moment, time seemed to have no meaning. Eventually, the sounds did fade. The forest grew quiet again, still with that unnatural hush to it. I opened my eyes, half expecting to see some horror looming over me. But there was nothing. Just trees, sunlight, the gentle rustle of leaves in a breeze I could not feel. I staggered to my feet, but my legs shook. I looked around wildly. I was alone. The voice, that presence, whatever it had been, it was gone now. I don't recall the hike back to the ranger station. That part is a blur in my memory, a jumbled mess of confusion and terror. I know I must have looked a fright when I stumbled through that door. I had leaves in my hair and scratches on my face. My eyes were wide. The other rangers gathered round, asking questions, trying to make sense of my babbled, incoherent story. I kept trying to explain it to them, but nothing I could say would make them understand the sheer terror I'd felt. And I'm not even sure they believed me. I'm sure some of them did. I went home early that day, took a few sick days. When I was out of sick days, I claimed a family emergency. Anything to avoid going back for a while. But I didn't hide forever. I still loved my job, loved the outdoors. This was only one rare occurrence out of years of work and even more years of outdoors experience. I told myself I was just unlucky. And to this very day, I still work at that park, and I never did experience anything quite like it again. I have but one lesson for you from this story. If you're out alone in the woods, far from other people, and you hear a voice calling out to you from off the trail, don't answer it. Thanks for tuning in to Tales from the Break Room, the home of the scariest true work stories. If you want to hear your story narrated by me, send it to me at eriecast.com/submit. We pay 5 cents per word for accepted stories. Help us grow by leaving Tales from the Break Room a rating and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast app. Check out eriecast.com or search for EerieCast on those very same podcast apps to see our other exciting and terrifying podcasts, like Unexplained Encounters, the other show I host, where I read stories with a focus on the supernatural. To get some merch, go to eriecast.store. And to unlock ad-free episodes of your favorite EerieCast shows and exclusive audiobooks, go to eriecast.com/plus and consider signing up for EerieCast Plus. You can follow me on Twitter, I guess it's X now, at Dark Prevails. You can also subscribe to me on YouTube, where I deliver the same content. Just look for Darkness Prevails. Good night. I hope we can share another break sometime soon.